Maddie Stark and John Fitzgerald from SCVO, and they're taking part in this webinar as part of DigiFest 2020, and I'll hand over to John.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm John Fitzgerald from the Scottish Council of Voluntary Organisations, and with my colleague Maddie, I'm going to be talking about the ways that we support organisations from the voluntary sector to evolve digitally. And I'm going to give a bit of an overview of the general approach that we take, what we've been doing in this last year, and then Maddie is going to talk in more detail about the work we do with senior leaders, because that's a really important part of the work that we do. So the first thing I wanted to say is that we've actually been supporting the voluntary sector to evolve digitally for over 5 years. And quite often this is a long-term gradual process. So a lot of organisations in the voluntary sector, probably the vast majority of them, are actually very small. They maybe only have 1 or 2 employees, so they don't have extra capacity to do a very dramatic digital transformation. So it's very deliberate that we use the word evolution and not transformation. So the way that we used to talk about digital evolution, when people asked us, why are you saying evolution rather than transformation, is it's this kind of pathway where organizations gradually change, and as they become more confident and adopt more technology, they're able to do many more things and unlock more impact. So a lot of organizations we start talking to early on, they may be right at the bottom in denial about technology, or they might be dinosaurs who are finding problems with their technology. But once they begin experimenting and trying out new stuff, they quickly learn that they can use digital as a very effective tool to enable them to achieve their mission more effectively. And because organizations in the voluntary sector often have small budgets and limited capacity, any improvement in the way they deliver their services can enable them to do a lot more, even if they've got the same budget and same resource. So as I say, it's been a gradual process, and we often end up supporting organizations over the long term to make changes to the way they do their work. And in support of that, we have quite a wide family of products. So we've got everything ranging from topical training to direct one-to-one support. And we've developed this over a while in response to the needs of the sector. One product I'm going to highlight in a bit more detail is our digital checkup. And this is a free online self-assessment. About 300 organizations have done this. And it gives them a very clear overview of where they're at in terms of their digital capability, turning their kind of vague worries about digital into more of a clear pathway and result. And it gives them ideas about what to do as next steps. And quite a few organizations, about 100 organizations, have gone on to take direct one-to-one support to discuss their result with us in more detail. And this is really an excellent starting point, so organizations can use this to get moving on their digital journey to begin with. And that's at digitalcheckup.org. So we have this broad family of products and ways of support that we offer, but this year has been very different because of the pandemic. So in March time, instead of our usual work to kind of keep people enthusiastic about digital, because organizations were all making an overnight switch to exclusively digital channels, we switched our focus to how can we reach a lot of people very quickly with advice they can easily put into action. And this is because thousands upon thousands of organizations were looking to implement digital tools overnight. We had to adapt to this to make sure that we stayed relevant. And one way we can underline the nature of that change is a lot of organizations were really approaching change at the rate of half a decade of change in a week. And that sounds quite dramatic, but what might that look like in practice? Well, on Monday, an organization might set up a virtual phone exchange so their switchboard could divert their phones to mobile phones in team members' home working situations. Tuesday, a team might get set up with team chat and video calling so they could work effectively together. On Wednesday, it might be about file storage, so things like Office 365 and G Suite, so the information that people needed to do their jobs was available to them from wherever they were working. On Thursday, it might be about an external video solution so that people you were working with could join meetings and events securely and safely. And then on Friday, if you had a bit of spare time at the end of the week, you might look at your website chats and mobile-friendly forums so that people could send you information in a structured format, but do it from their mobile device so that it wasn't a clunky process. Now, no single organization did all this in a single week, but this rate of change was what was happening. So people were looking for things they could get up and running in a day. And then as soon as they had something in place to cover one area, they were looking at the next piece of the puzzle. So people weren't sitting around, they were moving very quickly indeed. So in order to respond to this really dramatic change in the sector's ambition for digital, we work with Third Sector Lab, which is run by Ross McCulloch, and it's an independent agency that helps organisations deliver social change through digital. And also Tech for Good Live are Tech for Good's team based in Manchester, and they are real specialists in a podcast, so they helped us produce a podcast right through the pandemic months. In March and April, which is when we first got going with our change approach, we started with a DigiFest Zoom call, and we didn't have a detailed plan for how this would end up working, but the basic format is 1 hour to 90 minutes of basically live Q&A. So a few experts come on, share very briefly, probably only for about 5 minutes. And then the bulk of the time is given over to interactive Q&A from the audience. And these became really successful. We ran about 2 a week, and we're coming up to our 40th DigiShift now, and we reached well over 2,000 people through that channel. We also switched our digital checkup to a direct 15-minute helpline, so people didn't need to do a self-assessment first. They could just come to us directly and ask whatever questions they needed to. And we also began producing blogs because the same questions kept coming up over and over again. So we wrote them down in blogs so that people could access that information in a very easy and direct way. Later in the summer, we turned our DigiShift calls into podcasts because that was a very quick way of taking the highlights from our expert speakers and sharing it more widely. That was called DigiListen. We also started, once our blog posts became quite long and complex, we started converting those to how-to guides so that people could follow them step by step and work through more complex processes. Later on, still in the summer, we partnered with Third Sector Lab because they were running a series of training sessions called The Curve. And that series ran for 23 different sessions, just short 90-minute training sessions on a range of digital topics. And we contributed 5 of those topics, and the total series of training reached around 2,000 people again. So there was huge demand for this, and that was really striking to us because we'd anticipated that people might just need time to get on with the work, but actually people were still wanting to learn more about new digital techniques and platforms so they could use it in their day-to-day working lives. So obviously it was great that we were able to respond and really meet the needs of thousands of organizations. That was very rewarding, but also it was encouraging to hear directly the kind of qualitative feedback. So these are a few examples here where we can see that people weren't just pleased about getting new knowledge, but they also felt very supported by the fact they were a community of people all learning together. And I think particularly faced with the challenge of remote working, the fact that people felt they weren't alone and that other people were on the same journey was a huge source of encouragement. So it's great that people were supported by that. So I'm going to round out now with really the top 5 things that we learned in this very dramatic period. The first thing is that, and I think it's really important to stress this, is that charities of all sizes have a huge amount of confidence and agility. So even talking to very tiny organizations where it's only 1 part-time staff member and really no spare budget at all, they showed a huge amount of willingness to get on and try stuff. And that had such positive results. It was really impressive to see. Having said that, a lot of folk have been circling around the same basic questions. So the prime example I'd give of this is people wanted to know how to use Zoom safely to run online meetings. And the same question was being asked again and again and again. And that's why we ended up producing our blogs and our how-to guides to try and cater for that need so that people could make progress. People did make really rapid progress, but it was often focused on what we might call easy wins. So this would be things like finding a piece of commodity off-the-shelf technology that they could just sign up for or switch on within the space of a day. People didn't have the time or the inclination to go into projects where they needed to do lots of design and commissioning and setup. They needed things that just worked. So that did deliver a huge amount of impact and got people moving, but it meant that some of the bigger challenges haven't been touched yet. People really wanted to get advice from us directly, and that was very encouraging to see. Quite often on the 15-minute calls, I might be giving advice, and it might be something where somebody could find the answer themselves just by doing some careful Google searching. But people wanted to come to us, to SCVO, because they trusted us as a voluntary sector voice and body. So it was important that we had those answers at our fingertips so that people could move on and feel confident they had the right answers. And then finally, one thing which Maddie picked up over the summer is that we do quite a lot of horizon scanning to look and see what's the latest thinking in the tech sector. And when we checked in on our approach over the summer, we find that people in the very cutting edge of the tech industry were saying exactly what we were saying. So we were very much on message. But what we were doing, and I think this is very important, is that we were putting it across in terms that people could understand and relate to. Because people who are not tech experts, who are just running small voluntary organizations, they need to hear things in quite straightforward language so that it's not intimidating and it's easier for them to feel confident and make progress. So that's about it from me now. I'm going to pass over to Maddie, and she's going to give you more detail on our flagship Senior Leaders Programme. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Maddie Stark and I work for SCVO alongside John. What John has already mentioned is the idea that what we saw in the first few weeks of the pandemic was we saw that organisations really shifted their last 5 years of working into a very short space of time. This was a quote from Cathy Robinson from the National Lottery Community Fund. This was in the first few days of the pandemic. And what she said was the current moment sees organisations needing to undergo a digital transformation that would typically take a few years in the space of a few weeks. So whilst we were seeing that this is what organisations needed to do, they were actually doing it. They were getting out there and doing the work, as John really showed with the slides. The one thing in particular that we were doing with SCVO that I'm involved with is the Senior Leader Programme. This itself is a change management programme. So it's all about how do we manage culture, how do we manage behaviour change? And at the heart of it is digital. That's the catalyst and that's the context within which the change occurs. There are 5 key parts to the Senior Leader Programme. We look at leadership and governance, we look at organisational culture, service design, understanding how to be data-driven, and security. And security is very much about cyber, how to be cyber resilient, how to be aware of cyber issues and cyber faults that can come up, if you like. The Senior Leader Programme has been running throughout the pandemic. It ran before the pandemic and it still runs. So it's something that is now one of our most established products. We've had to shift this work online as much as everybody else. And actually this in itself has been a better outcome for us. It's working more and increasing the way that people are working together. People are understanding each other's problems a lot more and they're sharing a lot more. So it's very much becoming a peer learning program as we've seen it moving to digital. We use Zoom with the way that we deliver it with live sessions. And then we also have, we use a communication tool called Slack to allow us to carry out activities and homework in between the sessions. What we have really seen is what we would talk about before. So prior to us moving the service online, we always talked about the importance of, as a leader, about understanding, about being a role model, that if you're asking your organisation to use digital, you very much have to model that yourself. You have to be interested, you have to be showing that you're at least attempting to use it. You don't have to know everything about it, and there is really a lot to do with delegation. It's just having an overall passionate interest in digital and understanding its importance and its capabilities. The real difference with now to what we were doing in this current cohort to what we were doing last year, for example, is we're really putting a lot of pressure on governance and charities and voluntary organisations understanding the role that a digital trustee can have, having somebody on our board of directors who can really drive the digital agenda throughout the organisation. When we're looking at organisational culture, we're talking about, for example, understanding lean and agile tools and techniques and methodologies, how they can create smarter ways of working and they can support the increase in capacity, the increase in reach and the increase in improved service design. And then we're looking at service design itself and understanding that it's not for us to find a solution to somebody else's problem. It's for us to actually help that person figure out what the problem is and how our service can best meet their needs. So not fitting them into the service that we're providing, but fitting our service to meet their needs. And digital, again, can very much be at the heart of this. We can make a lot of assumptions around people's skills and abilities confidence and willingness to use digital. And actually what we can do is we can find out, well, where are the skill levels? Who's able to do what? How confident does somebody feel? And what we're finding is it's not necessarily the people that use the service who have got issues around that. It's actually staff members, and staff members can be gatekeepers to providing digital services. So unpacking that and looking at what we can do with that and putting the user at the heart of that. Being data driven is that idea around taking away from somebody else's opinion and actually thinking about what evidence have we got, what statistics have we got to back up what it is that we're trying to do. How can we use the data that we have to drive the change? How can we use the data that we've got to understand patterns and even do a little bit of predicting around where the sector might be going, or where our service might be going, or where some of the new gaps might be appearing? It takes it away from it being the loudest person in the room and actually puts evidence right at the heart of what we're talking about. And security itself is about how to manage digital risks and effectively to become cyber secure. So over the last 5-6 years, I think, that we've been running this, we've seen some real shifts in thinking with, as I said, with digital at the heart of this, and digital as the catalyst. And we've moved away from being funder-led, so that organisations, that idea, sorry, that as organisations would very much be focusing on what does the funder want, what are the funder needs, and we're now actually thinking around how can we change working practices to better suit the people that are using the service. So actually looking at what have we got, what resources have we got, where can we work better, where can we work smarter, and that idea of looking at systems and processes and understanding how our back-end systems and processes actually, if we can streamline those, we can free up staff to do much more of that front-facing work. So it's not about making redundancies, it's not about reducing funding, it's actually about using what we've got better and allowing people who are at the front line to deliver more frontline work instead of being caught up in administration, for example. It's also, we've seen a shift from competing against each other to actually working with each other. So again, back to that idea, if we were all fighting for the same funding, we're actually now moving towards, okay, my service is really good at this, your service is really good at that. So we don't need to be great at everything. Let's work together and collaborate. And then we can actually all together provide a better service for the people that we're working for. And that essentially is the shift between being social value led to being user value led. So this is the idea that really what we're talking about is that as a social value, that's about how a product or a service solves a social problem. But being user value led is really about how that product or that service in itself meets the user's definition of their wants and their needs and how it fits into their life. So again, it's back to that. It's not for us to create the solution for somebody. It's for us to help that person identify what the problem is, and then we can then work with them for them to help identify their own solution. What we have seen over the last 5 months with regards to this and using digital is that there is an underlying anxiety from our senior leaders. There is that kind of feeling of that perhaps we've missed something. A lot of our senior leaders, as they moved their services online, it seemed to be easier than they thought it was going to be. Staff were more enthusiastic, more motivated than they had anticipated, and actually they had a lot more in place as an organisation than they thought they did. Their equipment was better than they thought it was. Their staff skills were better than they thought they were. So there is now a kind of an underlying feeling of that was too good to be true. What have we missed? Have we missed something? When's this all going to go terribly wrong? So there's that general feeling of anxiety. And that's back to part of the work that John was doing and what John was saying around confidence. Staff have got a lot more confidence now, and they're then at that stage like, okay, I'm happy with this. I'm really confident about this. What else do I need to do now? What's the next stage? What's the next level? As opposed to sitting back and recognizing everything that they've achieved. We're also seeing a new type of leader, for want of a better phrase, within the sector, where our approach would very much be one of participation and collaboration with staff. What we're finding now, though, is that our leaders are having to be a lot more directive and prescriptive in taking on tools and the way that things are working. They themselves are feeling that they are doing to staff. They're not having conversations. They're not collaborating with staff members. They're telling them what to do, and that's just more of an uneasy feeling that we're not used to doing that. Whereas staff themselves are actually welcoming this and feeling, actually, I want you to tell me, do I use Teams? Do I use Slack? are we using Zoom? They want to just be given this is what we're going to do, and this is how we'll do it. So there's a lot more of that directive leadership actually coming out. My feeling is it will shift back to the collaborative and the participatory style. Just at this precise moment, staff are very much feeling that they need to have a lot more direction. And the leaders, again, back to that anxiety, are feeling a little bit anxious that that's not how they would work regularly. There's also a bit of anxiety around embedding a lot of the good things that have happened into new practice. There's conversations around when we go back to face-to-face delivery, when we go back to normal, whereas a lot of our senior leaders are saying, well, that's not going to happen. We've moved our services online. There are some things that have worked really well. Digital has really helped us increase capacity, increase our reach, made our service much more accessible. That will not go back to face-to-face. We're going to keep these parts that have worked really well. And there's an underlying feeling of, well, how do we do this? What do we do? So how do we keep what's worked? And how do we ditch what's not? From that, though, we are very much seeing these three things that are coming out. So this is over the last 5-6 years. So this is been accelerated by what's happened with the pandemic, but it's very much was happening anyway. We're seeing brand new collaborations, not just within sector, so not just sharing like-minded organisations. As John mentioned already, the Tech for Good Live from Manchester, so we were collaborating with them, but that whole Tech for Good movement is really coming to the fore at the moment. We're really seeing third sector organisations, voluntary sector organisations collaborating with startups. There's a Nesta report actually that's about at the moment called Better Together, how startups and third sector can collaborate. And that looks very much at how the voluntary sector and startups can benefit on both sides. So for our sector, the voluntary sector, tapping into startups' innovative ideas and ways of working can lead to increased impact. And for startups, it can make the difference between failing and scaling, so it can give them a bit more scope and a bit more understanding. There's that shift, as he said, from being value-led to user-led, and that's giving organisations the confidence to be more innovative. There's an example with the LGBT Youth Scotland where they were really struggling to connect with the people that use their service. They were using communication tools like Slack and Teams and email, and it wasn't working particularly well. So what they did is they went to, well, where are the people that use our service? How are they communicating with each other? How do they talk to each other when they're not online, if you like? So when they're kind of out of hours, how are they communicating for fun with each other? And they found out they were using a gaming platform called Discord. So now LGBT Youth Scotland use this platform to communicate with the people that use their service. So they've changed the way that this platform was made. So they've changed the use of this platform to shift it from being gaming to actually help with their service delivery. We're also seeing, I suppose, for me, most importantly, we're seeing a lot more diversity in staff teams. And by that, I mean, we're seeing people who are coming from out with the voluntary sector. So it's people who are coming with very different training, very different backgrounds, very different approaches, and they're bringing new eyes, new ideas, new thoughts, new energy. We're getting people from the tech world. We're getting people from startups. We're getting people from who were running their own business. So all kinds of organizations, software developers, coders, data experts who are coming into our sector, who are bringing with them all these new skills, all this new enthusiasm, and all these new experiences. And that really is helping us with the collaboration and the innovation, and is driving us forward as a sector, I would say. That's very much me. So thank you very much.
Hi everyone, I hope you enjoyed that brief run through. I guess we're open for questions now for a bit. I think maybe the session host can say how long we've got, but we're really happy to talk more about what we're up to and also hear about what you've been doing in your sectors as well.
Hiya. Yeah, so we've had some nice questions coming in. I believe Nessa Barry will also jump in to help facilitate. And there she is. I'll hang over to her.
Hi everybody. Sorry, my video just took a wee minute to click on and I realised how pink I look. So that's always a lovely start to a Friday morning. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things. Is it all right if I ask the question first?
Please do.
So I think it's really interesting to see some parallels between what we can casually refer to as sectors, health, social care, voluntary sector, housing, and I'm as guilty of that as anybody. I think these challenges are being felt wherever you work, in public sector and probably beyond. I just wonder when you're, and you did touch on this, but I just wondered if you could say a bit more on it. When you're talking to different groups of staff and when you're working with them in this way, are they kind of biting your hand off? You know, are they really enthusiastic, or are they quite frightened, or are they, you know, does it vary depending on which level of the organization you're working with? Sorry, that's a bit of a cheeky question, but that's my question to start. Thank you.
That's a really good one. I don't know, Maddie, shall I briefly talk about the checkup side, and then you can say what you've experienced with senior leaders? So on the checkup, we run that for 2 years, and I think that historically it was often, you remember that slide I had about the kind of pathway of digital evolution with all the different creatures on it? Well, people were kind of going forward quite cautiously and quite steadily. So a lot of our work pre-pandemic was really about boosting people's confidence and saying, no, it will be beneficial, you can move more quickly, it's low risk, just get on with it. But then obviously from late March, that flipped around completely, and it was like people wanting to do it all in a very short space of time. So it did get to the kind of bite your hand off stage. And that's why we had to kind of triage a wee bit and say, well, what are the things that are most relevant right now, and just try and get messaging out as quickly as we could. And that's why the DigiShift was quite a good format for that, because we could very quickly keep up with the changing needs as they moved on. But I'll pass to Maddie now, because she'll probably say a bit more about the senior leaders side.
I think it's just to kind of echo what John said there. It was a bit of a slow start, I think, with senior leaders were coming to us initially 6 years ago because funding was getting tighter, and they were aware that in order to increase capacity and reach more people and work with more people, they were going to have to make some internal changes, but not willing to, or in my view quite rightly, let staff go, but actually thinking, how can we help the staff that we currently have to do more with what they've got? So that was kind of the initial driver, I think. Whereas now we're seeing it very much as digital as a necessity as opposed to a nice to have. It's something that every organization that we're working with is now saying, we should have this, we need to have this. And those that kind of had started that thought process have made that shift far easier than those who hadn't. So we're kind of seeing a widening gap, I think, between the organizations who, even just in their thinking and their beginning to change the culture to shift towards digital, to those that maybe put staff on furlough that first time round because they couldn't figure out how to shift their staff and move their services online. That's now got a lot bigger, and we're now kind of getting a sense of panic and fear from those organizations that are coming through going, right, we didn't do this first time round, we need to do this now, and we need to do this quickly. So there is a kind of a panic that's occurring from them. And then as that other group who did do that in the first round, they are now at that next stage where they're very much full of confidence and full of enthusiasm and what's next, bring it on. So we're kind of seeing these different things widening, I think.
Thank you both. That's really interesting. Yeah, and again, I can draw some parallels from other parts of health and care where there's just that much variation in what you're trying to work, the way you're trying to work, who you're trying to work with, where they are in terms of their readiness to change and to adopt. And a lot of that, I think, is not about the technology. I mean, of course, you need the skills and the understanding of how to use the technology, as this event has proven to me on an hourly basis. But actually, much more than that, you need to have that kind of mental readiness or confidence, or I don't know, it's a variety of different things, isn't it, that you need to have?
Yeah, I think one thing that's definitely an interesting factor at play in the voluntary sector is a lot of the things we do are really essential services. So if you're supporting a really vulnerable group, you've got to make sure that's fit for purpose. You can't kind of half do it. You need to do it really well. And that's right, we're doing very difficult work sometimes, but I think that can sometimes make organizations really cautious around change. So they think, well, I don't want to set up a new way of doing a service because it might not work, and that would be really bad. But there are, I think the beauty of digital is there's ways you can experiment and test things at a small scale and learn really quickly. So you're not having to, buy new equipment or premises or anything like that. You can try a new way of operating over a short period of time and really understand whether that's delivering user value. And so I think that's one of the big changes in mindset we'd like to see is organizations feeling a bit bolder, but also, as Maddie had said in her talk, about being data driven. So looking at how something performs in the real world and really taking that on board and using it to adapt your practice.
Again, I'm just reflecting that the interview we showed on Monday, which is available to everybody in the resources library, with the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport and the COSLA spokesperson for Health and Social Care, there was a strong sort of theme in that of if not now, when, and be a bit braver. I think the phrase radically practical or something like that was used at one point. I'll try and remember that. So let me just pick up a question and stop hogging all the chat. So Anne-Marie Doherty has asked a question. Thanks, Anne-Marie. She's saying, thank you very much for the presentation, really interesting. But what advice would you give to anyone interested in moving this forward? And that might come back to some of the links you kindly shared, John, but I'll let you answer.
Okay, are you happy if I start this one, Maddie, or do you want to?
Go for it.
Yeah. So Anne-Marie, can I ask is it within a single organization or within a network?
Well, Anne-Marie doesn't say that. I know Anne-Marie works in community development, has worked in community development in particular, if that helps. So probably more.
Okay. Well, I'll kind of answer for both briefly, and then we can see where that goes. So if you're within a single organization, my suggestion would probably be start with a digital checkup and a conversation within your team. And that might be one where you're actually looking at pain points at things that aren't working very well. And I think a really good starting point is to kind of get agreement on something that isn't working brilliantly that you'd like to make better, particularly something that maybe is stopping you from reaching your users or something that's taking a long time to do. And then make that your kind of your next priority. Now, obviously, there's a challenge where if you end up picking something that you've been trying to fix for years, that might be an impossible task. But very often there's a kind of, you might call it a barnacle on the boat. There's a kind of a small thing that's holding everything back that you could really fix in a short time frame. And that can generate a lot of positive momentum because people think, oh, we solved that and we're now in a better place. And then that generates a bit of enthusiasm for looking at other stuff. I think if you're in a network, and we've done work with carers organizations and housing associations, and quite an interesting practice there is to get everyone around a table and compare notes. So it could be a kind of frank conversation about experiences you've had with vendors, or thinking about where your service users want you to be in terms of capability. But that can often be quite fruitful, because what we were surprised with the carers organizations is they're quite small organizations, they're quite a small group, there's only 30 odd of them, but there's a real range of ability. And I think there's something quite powerful if you're an organization working in one part of Scotland and you think to yourself, well, we're only a small team, we're only half a dozen people, but you can see that one of your peers has done something really good and done it well, then that's a big incentive for you to go to that place as well, because you can't say, oh, well, we can't do it because we're too small, because one of your neighbours has gone and done it. So I think that's often quite a positive step forward. But I'll just pass to Maddie now so that I'm not waffling on at too much length.
I would say one of the key things that we talk about in the Senior Leader Programme, and the best bit of advice that our alumni give to each other, is go and speak to somebody who's done it already. Whatever it is that you are thinking of doing, it is highly unlikely it is the first time it's ever been thought of. So if you are thinking that you would like to change the way you're delivering your service, you want to put bits online, you're even thinking about developing an app, somebody will have done it somewhere. It might not be the same sector, it might be a slightly different organisation, but there will be a lot of transferability around what it is that somebody's done. and it's the best way to actually discuss how do you move things forward, how do we get started, what do you do, you know, what were the pitfalls. And we're finding more and more that people are very willing now at this stage to share all the kind of things that have happened to them and all the pitfalls that they've had. So that's the biggest bit of advice that I would do, is go and speak to somebody who's done this already.
Maddie, we've had a couple of questions in. Now, just to let people know, I posted in the chat the link to some of the DigiShift resources the SCVO have. I'm not sure if you'd already posted that, but I joined a number of the webinars earlier, you know, pre-summer into summer. I found them really, really helpful and interesting from my point of view, and I think anybody would. And it just picking up that point about seeing what other people are doing and making connections to your own area of practice or your own area of work. So Andrew McFarlane, thank you, Andrew. Andrew said, can you speak to the challenges of funding for organisations in driving digital services and innovation, particularly in the situation of how services are currently commissioned? Are organisations having to fund this themselves? That's a big question, Andrew. Who wants to go first?
That's a great one. I'll hop on. I probably won't be able to answer it fully, but I'm sure Maddie will be able to fill in the blanks. I think that we need funding was a really common refrain at the beginning of our work in digital, because, you know, there isn't spare capacity. You know, in the voluntary sector, if an organisation has got capacity, it will allocate that to meeting the need. It'll put it on the front line. You won't sit there and have a kind of team of business analysts sharpening up their spreadsheets or whatever business analysts do these days. So yes, it is a challenge. I think one really interesting factor around digital is the kind of tools that would make huge impact with the voluntary sector are basically free. So, you know, G Suite is free for charities. It's basic, but that's quite fully featured. And certain levels of Office 365 are also free. So I think the big change we've seen in the last 10 years is some really powerful platforms have become commodity tech, and even organizations with limited know-how and very limited budget can just pick them off the shelf and do stuff with them. I think the big kind of resource gap we've seen has really been about having enough staff time to kind of drive these projects forward. So in a few instances, we've seen funding available for technology, but not funding available to really understand the needs or drive the project forward. And what you tend to see there is, you know, some technology gets bought, but it maybe doesn't meet the user needs. And I think a kind of contrast I would draw is, if you say, what is digital for good? I think you'd say it's an end-to-end service that delivers some user value. Like Maddie was saying, that's the real thing, is people in the world need to see some benefit. That's the bottom line. And in contrast, technology is often things that cost a lot of money that are very hard to operate and maybe don't deliver user value in some cases. And I think that's the kind of contrast we would make, is, you know, with the really huge positive factor we're seeing today is you could go out there with a Google Sheet and a basic Zoom package and really actually go and reach some users and do something useful. It's so cheap to do. But the problem is carving out that spare time to experiment and drive it forward. And I think what we're kind of looking ahead to see now is that people have done a lot very quickly, and they're going to need some spare capacity to turn that into long-term solutions that they can keep in place and make sure that they're fully reliable and so on. It's passed to Maddie.
Yeah, I think it's I think there was somebody else's question about, was it Peter, yours around the agile, the agile sticker around, I don't think it means what you think it means. That kind of relates to the funding issue around we always talk about, certainly with the Senior Leader Programme and within a lot of the digital evolution work that I do, that short-term investment in an organisation in helping staff understand the importance of digital, the power of digital, the reach of digital, can then have a real kind of long-term impact. So that short-term investment in some tech that works really well and does what an organisation needs to do. And then I suppose prior to that, as John said, it's not, we can spend as much money on the best computers in the whole of the world, but if staff don't know how to use them, then they're worthless, utterly worthless. So actually it's thinking around, well, what is it that staff need in order to provide the best service that they can? So that goes back to the kind of being user value led. What is the problem we're trying to solve? What are the tools we need to solve this problem? What is it then that staff need to be able to do this work? And going right back and investing and finding funding for that particular part will then drive the rest. And that's where funders are really, I think from my point of view, are really starting to listen. So they are looking at investing in change management, transformational change, evolution, that kind of stuff. Whereas they have in the past, even funders have had their fingers burned by giving funding towards a CRM, £60,000 to a CRM that nobody uses because we didn't actually find out what was its purpose, what did we want it to do. So there's different aspects to that, and actually we're seeing a shift in the mindset of funders to be able to ask better questions as to what is the funding for, what gap is it going to fill. Let's just not provide a service because somebody thinks it's a great idea. What's the actual evidence? Where's the data to say that this service is needed? And those are the key things, I think, towards funding. And then that's part of the agile, sorry to answer that question in the same breath, I hope that kind of makes sense. And the agile aspect of that is actually being able to make better use of the resources that we have. So actually as a project management tool, understanding having the right people at the right time doing the right job. And that might be different people moving and shifting in and out of things, but actually as the team that we have right now, are they the right team to develop or produce the service that's needed right now? And then back to that, well, what is actually the problem that this service will solve? What is it that we're trying to do? What are we trying to achieve? And that for me is the key things, I suppose, around lean. Sorry, I'm just going to move to something, is that idea about describing a kind of a way of planning and doing something. And it's about making changes, so making kind of small iterative changes. And that also then goes back to funding, that if you're making the small iterative changes, then you're not producing a fully formed service. Here you go. Nobody wants it. What a waste of money. Actually, you're doing small incremental changes that will then have a bigger impact and over a longer term can have greater success. Hope that answers that. That was a bit of a ramble from me, sorry.
Thank you, Maddie. John, I don't know if you wanted to come back in on the agile bit, but we have a couple of other questions as well, so I'll let you decide.
Sure. Well, Maddie is our agile expert, so I'll not kind of second guess what she said, but I think, yeah, the point she was making there about de-risking it, so both de-risking a project approach as you go along and saying, well, let's check in more often and not wait right until the end to find out whether something worked or not. And also for funders as well, I think Maddie was hinting there that funders find that quite uncomfortable. You know, they're quite used to saying, well, we'll give you a big word, well, often not really a big word of cash, but we'll give you some cash and we want a finished thing at the end. And I think it's quite new territory for funders to say, you're going to basically do a kind of rolling pilot and keep testing all the way along. But I think it must be the right way to go because it's, you know, from the tech sector, you can see how powerful that is, that there's a kind of, you're iterating all the time and adapting, which means that people get a product that stays relevant rather than something that by the time it's finished, they're doing something different. And I might just pull in Scott's question here because he asked a question about a roadmap for transformation. And I think that's a really interesting one because I think you saw on the slide I had kind of charting evolution, and sometimes it feels because I talk to about 100 charities a year at all stages, and you do sometimes think to yourself, well, is there a sort of a standard set of steps? And I think actually the answer is no. Sometimes the smallest organizations I talk to are the ones who are furthest ahead because they've just been quite bold and made some clever connections of services together. And I think the other thing is, traditionally, I think with a digital transformation, you might see the kind of end state. You're doing really good digital stuff in a whole different range of domains. But I would actually feel that digital excellence for a voluntary sector organization would probably just be doing one thing really, really well. And it might not feel like a very glamorous thing. Like one good example might be if you're an appointment-based service where people come to meet with a service provider. If you can have a brilliant appointment system that just reminds people when they need to come, what they need to bring with them, that doesn't sound very dramatic, but it could, improve the outcomes of those meetings by kind of 50 or 60%, because people are better prepared and they don't miss meetings and so on. And because the voluntary sector has a very finite amount of resource, if you can make it more efficient, then you improve the outcomes for the same money coming in into the budget. So I think I would probably shy away a bit from a kind of standard roadmap. I think there are probably, on our digital checkup, if you do it, you'll see that people get benchmarked according to income bracket. So I think that's a frame that we found has been quite powerful for the voluntary sector. If you can say other charities in your area and in your size have already done this, then that does really encourage people, because it means they feel a bit of peer pressure to do it, but also they see, well, look, it is feasible. Somebody else has been here before. I'll pass back to Maddie in case she wants to add anything.
No, okay. I'm just conscious of time, so I'll try and pick up some of these points from the chat, folks. So Anne-Marie's come back with a bit more of an explanation. Thanks, Anne-Marie, that she's working with a range of different social care providers, Glasgow Health and Social Care Partnership, to take forward an initiative called Connecting Neighbourhoods. That's a collaborative approach for nighttime support. And the aim is to introduce new ways of working together, and introducing technology where it's seen to be an option. It's a two-parter, so we are developing a neighbourhood approach involving individuals, families, independent advocacy, fire and rescue, housing, social care. This is integration and collaboration at its best. I like the idea of the blog to promote and keep people engaged and to see the challenges and change what is happening. I suppose with all of this, it's about, is the outcome or the journey what is the important thing? So I'll say that again, is it the outcome or the journey that's important? Sorry, Anne-Marie, if I've mangled that a bit, so over to you.
There's a few threads in there. I guess one thing that seems to be in Anne-Marie's question, which I think is a really interesting one, is about working in the open. So that comes from the government digital service. You know, probably about 10 years ago now, I guess they were very keen to kind of be radically transparent about what they were doing. So sharing works in progress, explaining that they were trying something out that might not work. And that's quite new, I think, for the public sector and probably for a lot of the voluntary sector as well, because, you know, we don't like to show where we're getting things wrong. We like to show where it's worked very well. Thank you very much. So that's an interesting practice. And I think it'd be interesting there if you've got a lot of different partners in different sectors working together. Some may feel, well, we're not quite sure if we can be radically transparent because we might get embarrassed by it. And then the outcome versus journey, I guess. For me, I think the best evaluation question you can ever ask is who is doing what differently and why. So, and it could be a kind of very beginning and end, so cutting out the middle completely and saying, right, in 5 years' time, everybody is accessing mental health support online, perhaps something like that. But I think when you pick up individual points along the journey, you'll probably see smaller changes as well. So, and I think that's the thing with the agile methodology that Maddie is talking about, is when you make it iterative, you focus on those small changes that make big impacts. So you don't kind of wait until you get to a fully fledged version 1.0 or version 1.2. You're making a micro change probably on a weekly basis. And what you're doing is testing and learning to see all the positive impacts adding up. So I think for me, that means the journey is quite important. So you're not going out there to your service users and saying, sit tight, we're going to deliver something in 2 years. They'll come with you in a journey and see something developing. And they'll maybe also see a live prototype. So it might be something that feels quite basic, doesn't look very nice. And we actually did that ourselves with our DigiShift calls. So the problem we had in April is we had to register people for Zoom bombing reasons. So our kind of prototype that we made in 10 minutes was a Google Sheet and capturing emails that way. So that meant we could run that call on that day without blocking everyone off. And then a week or two later, we had something more robust in place. So that was a kind of piece of agile development where instead of saying we can't do it at all, we put something in place as a quick solution and then developed it further.
I know, I think Maddie has to leave to deliver training this morning, so I'm just going to try and take a final few points, please. So we had a question also, I think you've addressed the bit about the roadmap from Scott, thank you. And Robert McDade has asked, what about the relationship between going digital and the need for changes in working practice to then optimize this? Maddie?
Yeah, so that for me is very much what the Senior Leader Programme is about in itself, and also where the checkup becomes really useful. From the point of view for me, and how I ask people to use the checkup tool is to be able to look at a starting point for change. So using, as I kind of said, digital as the catalyst for a bigger change management program, and actually starting with the checkup to have that initial conversation, to reduce some of the fears that people might have, and also to identify, is there a difference between what senior management think and what operational staff think as to where gaps maybe are, so it can start that whole conversation that gets out fears, that gets out any kind of issues and challenges, or at least can have that initial, right, we're all doing this together, and begin that collaborative approach. And then I think the other side of that is that introducing digital, it's a culture change. It's that starting with, right, where do we start? Let's think about what's the problem we're trying to achieve. Where can we make some of those quick wins? And actually, as John already said, that let's pick one thing and let's get that as right as we can, and then go back and think, okay, so how did that work? So using that agile technique of going back and doing retrospectives, what worked well with that? What didn't? What kind of worked? What are we going to ditch? What are we going to keep when we're moving forward? And even working in kind of short, would be time boxed, kind of time bound sprints, for example, 5 to 10 days of actually thinking around, actually, what can we achieve in this period of time? What small changes can we make that will then have an impact on how people are working, and then ultimately the service that we're providing? So it's very much it's a mindset change, it's a culture change, and that will not happen overnight. And we've seen that happen, I think, again, John's slides, within the last 5 to 6 months. What we did see was we saw a lot of organizations putting their services online, but the mindset and the way of working remained the same. So people were still having 2-3 hour long team meetings, but they were doing them on Zoom. People were still having internal, and I mean, you may be doing it yourself, you have your whole, you start at 9, you finish at 5, and each day is a Zoom meeting, so you can't physically achieve anything. So it's actually, how do we change the way of working so that we can then free up staff time? And that in itself is the mindset's change. So that's probably where we're at now, is thinking about culture, thinking about leadership, and moving that shift towards this more agile way of working, I guess. John?
Yeah, that's a really good kind of picture on that, and I think really helpful to understand it's both quite radical but also kind of incremental. And I think that's the kind of the tricky balance we always try and make, because I think, we need to say the intention and the ambition needs to stay radical, because I think the big risk a lot of organizations fall into is just digitizing an old process. So, like, I'll give you a funny example that every organization would have is, you might have an inbound inquiry phone line, and I bet you loads of organizations today have one staff member who answers the inquiry number and then writes emails to colleagues who might look at the email 2 days later and get back, and then that other colleague has to ring back. Now, you could digitize that in a sort of superficial way by forwarding voicemail recordings as MP3s, I guess. But you could also take a step back and say, well, hang on a minute, most people who ring in probably need something that's on a web link. So why don't we have a kind of chat service that helps us engage? Or maybe it's using WhatsApp for Business, so that instead of the user translating their inquiry into voice and then us emailing it around and so on and so forth. So, you can do some simple things along the way, but ultimately you need to get out of the box and not just digitize a paper process, because that's really common. I think what tends to happen is people think, well, if it's happening on a digital device, then it's digital, and that's not necessarily the case. There are really transformational opportunities that you can unlock if you really rethink what you're trying to do. And that's where we get back to the user-driven aspect again as well, and say, basically you need to really think in a very deep way about what's the user trying to do here. So try and make it easy for them. And sometimes our traditional processes, without meaning to, make it a lot more complex than it needs to be. And I think that for me, that's one of the biggest pieces of potential of digital, is you can really meet the user where they are and deal with things very effectively and in a very friendly way.
Both, and I am going to say draw to a close. I can see you guys have shared links to the senior leadership program, and we've shared links also to the digital checkup. And I'd also encourage you to take a look at the other DigiShift resources that the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations have on their website. They're really helpful and useful. Whatever level you're at, whatever organisation you're in, they're really worth a look. That's been a great session. Thank you both very much. And thank you to everybody for engaging in the chat as well. That always helps. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.